Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari.
Hare Krishna, everyone. Welcome to Books Are the Basis. We are celebrating the Books Are the Basis Week 2023. And this year's topic is Shastra Chakshu, seeing the world through Srila Prabhupada's books. And yeah, we're very honored to have with us our special guest today, His Holiness Hridayananda Das Goswami Maharaj. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna Maharaj, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thank you. I feel great privilege to get a chance to associate with you in this way. Of course, Maharaj is one of the most senior member of our movement. Maharaj was one of the first GPC members. He was among the first devotees who acted as or still serves as a initiating spiritual master after Srila Prabhupada's departure and till today. And Maharaj originally comes from Los Angeles, California, and there he actually met Srila Prabhupada at the university campus, and we will talk about that also.
Actually, that was in Berkeley, California.
Berkeley. We will talk about that. I would like to hear your first encounter with Prabhupada. And then in 1790, Maharaj received his formal initiation and then started, of course, taking up a responsibility. I think you were the president of different centers beginning in Gainesville, Florida, Houston, and so on. And then from 74 onwards, Prabhupada requested you to take care of Latin America.
Yeah, I took sannyas in 72.
Oh, in 72 already. Yeah.
23. Yeah. And then I started traveling around America, doing programs in universities. And then in 74, Prabhupada asked me to take responsibility for Latin America.
Yeah. And still today, Maharaj is very much involved in Latin America. And is one of
advisory role. I mean, as a preacher and advisor. And of course, I have no administrative function, thank God.
And of course, we are here from the Ministry of Education and talking about books. And one of your major contribution also to our society is the translation, like the completing the Prabhupada's translation and commentary on the Srimad Bhagavatam, of course, with a group of other senior devotees. But I think you were leading that project, and
yeah, it was my idea
to take it up.
That we have to finish Prabhupada's books, and I saw that there was a system in place that just was not going to do it. So I asked Gopi Pranadhana and Rameshwar, who was the BBT trustee, if Gopi could work with us on that. And they both agreed, which is very good. And then I asked Pradyumna to also join, but he at that point declined. And of course, Ravita was the editor. So the system we had in the beginning, because sometimes whoops, I better turn off the this noise on my phone, because it's not generally understood how it was actually done. So perhaps I could just take a moment and explain that.
Yeah, please. That would be very interesting.
So in 1980, we began. I was ad hoc GBC of Berkeley at the time, and Gopi came there. And at that point, of course, he was a very good Sanskrit scholar. And at that point, I wasn't. I mean, I knew some Sanskrit, but not on his level. So the system we began was that he would do a preliminary translation, and he would also translate perhaps three of the main commentaries he would translate from the Sanskrit. I think it was Sridhar Swami, probably Vishwanath Chakravarti, and Jiva Goswami, and sometimes Veera Raghavacharya or Jayadwaja. And so I would take his preliminary translation, and then I would come up with a final translation. And then I used the commentaries he did, and I would do the purports. So the purports were entirely done by me, and the final translation, but of course with Gopi's essential help. And So we progressed in that way. We talked about it, and we were all sort of in fear of Prabhupada's injunction, don't jump to the 10th canto. So because of that, because the 10th canto involved the Rasa Leela, and also because in the Krishna book, Prabhupada had basically given the 10th canto.
Yeah.
I mean, the Krishna book really, it began as a summary study in which Prabhupada didn't translate every verse, but just gave a summary. But that only lasted for about the first 10 verses of the first chapter. And then if you compare the Krishna book to the 10th canto, which of course I did in the course of the work, Prabhupada started as a summary study, but after just a couple of verses, he just translated everything. And so the Krishna book really is a complete translation of the 10th canto, interspersed with some commentaries, which were not separated as purports, but were just integrated into the text. So because of that, because of the 10th canto, we decided we'll start with the 11th canto. So I decided that we would start with the 11th canto. So then we did the 11th canto, the 12th canto, and then went back to the 10th canto and completed that. Because Prabhupada had begun you could say, with his normal format to translate the 10th canto, and got up to the prayers of Lord Brahma after Brahma, made the mistake of testing Krishna's mystic powers. So we worked, and of course, as time went on, especially in the 11th canto, and then the 12th canto, of course, we did the 11th and 12th. My own knowledge of Sanskrit became, better and better. And then at a certain point, Gopi went to, so I was, in a sense, taking more and more responsibility. But from the very beginning, the purports were 100% my purports. The purports were not a group effort.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so then at a certain point, Gopi went to India. And in those days, there was no internet, there was nothing, and so it became very difficult to communicate with him. So by the time we got into the 10th canto, really, at a certain point, I was pretty much doing all the work. Because because the communications were very difficult in India. So, and then as we neared completion, we'd done the 11th and 12th cantos and the 10th canto. And so I wanted to honor Gopi for his invaluable contribution. And so I requested him to independently do the last 10 chapters of the 10th canto. Mm-hmm. So basically, we worked together on the translations, and the purports were mine. I wrote the purports. It was not collaborative. And Gopi, of course, provided valuable help by supplying translations of commentaries of some of the acharyas. And when we got to the 11th canto, also he was sometimes translating them, or I was just using, I think. Actually, I had to translate myself Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's translation commentary. But as I said, at a certain point, I pretty much had to do it mostly by myself, I think, for a good deal of the work. Mm-hmm. And I did all the purports I did until the last 10 chapters, 10th canto. So that's how we did it. And then, of course, Dravida was editing.
Yeah. And
just like he was also editing for Prabhupada.
Yeah. How long did it took the whole effort to complete all the?
We began around April of 1980.
Mm-hmm.
And I think within 3 or 4 years, it was done.
Yeah. It must have been a very wonderful time being absorbed in Srila Prabhupada's books and the Bhagavatam, and then in the commentaries. And yeah.
Yes, it was. It was. It was wonderful. And in the beginning, of course, I was simply trying to not just sound like Prabhupada, but I was just trying to like, what would Prabhupada say? And
Yeah,
then,
to be loyal as a.
yeah. And I think, of course, I'm sure he remained loyal, but Prabhupada once wrote me a letter and said, read my books and then explain them in your own words.
Mm-hmm.
So Prabhupada encouraged us to not only translate, let's say, like the Bhagavatam into Spanish or French or German, but also he really called upon me to do a cultural translation. So as I worked on the Bhagavatam, starting 11th canto, 12th canto, then 10th canto, I'm more and more, I sort of, you could say, while remaining, I hope, completely loyal to Prabhupada, but sort of found my own voice. And my voice, naturally, because of my background, is more sort of Western rational voice. And so, but again, I had that direct instruction from Prabhupada. In fact, the very first personal instruction I received from Prabhupada, I was very fortunate because, as we know, the first instruction Prabhupada received from his guru became his life's mission.
Mm-hmm.
And by Prabhupada's mercy, I had a similar experience. The first question I ever asked Prabhupada directly when I was just a new brahmachari in Berkeley was whether I should stay in the university at Berkeley or just do full-time temple service. And Prabhupada wrote back to me and said I should complete my education. He said that he wanted me to be well-educated so that I could present Krishna consciousness to other well-educated people. And so the very first instruction I received from Prabhupada was to read other books and to make a cultural translation.
Maybe we could just talk on this, starting with, first of all, the topic is Shastra Chakshu, looking to the world through the eyes of Prabhupada's books, and we would like to talk a bit about education. And you met Prabhupada at the university campus in Berkeley, right? So Prabhupada.
I first heard Prabhupada. I didn't meet him in the sense of being interested in him, but that's when I first saw him.
Yeah. So Prabhupada came there to give a talk at the university, and you were one amongst the students listening to Prabhupada. So how was it? Do you remember what you specifically remember from this talk? Or
what I remember very well is my first impression of Prabhupada.
Uh-huh.
And I'll just add that Prabhupada at that point was making a tour of American universities. And my good friend, H.D.Goswami, saw Prabhupada on the other side of the country, but during that same tour.
Oh, okay.
Prabhupada spoke at his university, Brandeis. And then he spoke, of course, at my school, Berkeley. But it was during the same tour that we both saw Prabhupada for the first time.
It was successful.
My first impression, Berkeley, of course, was very much an epicenter of the whole revolutionary, movement of the young people back then. And one of the key features of that movement, which was in some ways was idealistic, in other ways, extremely immature, is that a rejection of authority. Like no one, your parents were hopeless. You loved your parents, but they were hopeless because they supported the war in Vietnam and they, were some sort of doubtful about the whole civil rights movement. So, your parents were obviously not authorities. Reminds me of what Mark Twain once said. He said when he was young, he left home because his parents didn't understand anything. And he came back a few years later and he was amazed at how much they learned in his absence. So it's kind of a joke. In other words, we rejected our parents as authorities. Even the professors, we didn't really accept as authorities because they didn't show up for the revolutionary demonstration. So the professors were not really trustworthy and the government was the enemy. And so it was very much, so when I saw Prabhupada, my first impression as he walked into the hall, my first impression was, this is a real authority. And that was a very extreme impression in those days. And Prabhupada seemed to me like a military commander, just the way he carried himself, the way he walked. He just sort of exuded legitimate authority and power. And of course, he was surrounded by his disciples who were also kind of in that same mood. They would have been people like Tamal Krishna and Vishnu Jana and others. So that was my first impression. Prabhupada walked in like a military commander. I just knew, wow, I'd never seen a person who just
has this,
had that, who just radiated authority the way he did.
Oh.
So then the devotees, there was a little stage at the front. And in those days, in Berkeley, in general in America, 69, everything was experience. You had to experience everything. And so I walked in with a few friends and they took seats, and I went right to the front, sat down on the floor with devotees. Because I'd seen the devotees on campus. Sometimes I gave them little donations, and I was just, and they just struck me as genuine, as somehow they were the real thing. And so I sat down there on the floor, and then Prabhupada came in, and he sat on a Vyasasana on this little stage, and the kirtan began. And of course, the devotees were all young. Prabhupada was there. It was an extremely ecstatic kirtan, and I had never in my life experienced, you could say, ecstatic religious worship. Because, I just came from a Judeo-Christian tradition where you go into a nice church or synagogue and, okay, please turn to page 57. Please stand up, follow me as we chant this. And you say, okay, now please sit down. It's all very sedate. It's all very, you stand up, sit down, sing this song, now say this prayer. And so ecstatic religious observance, because with Prabhupada there, the devotees were just really in ecstasy. And I remember I was in the middle of it and I was not ecstatic. And in my heart, Krishna revealed it in my heart, I knew why I was not ecstatic. And Krishna gave me that realization that these devotees have earned it. They're practicing spiritual life. You're not practicing spiritual life. You don't deserve to be ecstatic. And so I had that realization. And so then Prabhupada got up off his Vyasasana, sometimes called in American Sanskrit Vyasasana. So Prabhupada got up off the Vyasasana and he began to dance in ecstasy, and he was jumping off the ground, and he was dancing in ecstasy. And at that point, that was 1969. So Prabhupada would have been, I guess, about 72 and a half years old. And so for young college students, 72 and a half was like 480 or something. So Prabhupada, he was dancing. And when Prabhupada began to dance in ecstasy, the devotees just, they went wild and, with ecstatic Krishna consciousness. And I remember I became disoriented. It's almost like in the 11th chapter of the Gita where Arjuna says to Krishna when he's bewildered by the universal form, Disho na jane, which means I can't discern the directions. It's like he was so overwhelmed by the universal form that he couldn't even tell what's up, what's down, what's right, what's left. And so that's what I felt. I just saw bodies flying past me. I mean, literally, they were just like bodies were just flying all over. And I was in the middle of it. And of course, the devotees were young and athletic. So, and Prabhupada was dancing and the devotees were dancing. I was just, some foolish college student in the middle of all of it. But so that made a very powerful impression on me because I knew it was legitimate. It wasn't, I had a really good sense for what was fake and what was real. And I knew that this was genuine spiritual ecstasy. It was completely spontaneous. And to see Prabhupada dancing. So then I heard the lecture. If you would have asked me afterwards what Prabhupada said, but somehow I knew he was speaking the truth. And I vaguely remember he said something like, if you just read Bhagavad Gita, you don't have to read any other Vedic literature. And I had no idea what Vedic literature was, but I thought, well, that's great. if I just read Bhagavad Gita. I have
That's
no
just
idea.
good. Yeah, it's a good one book. And which was the first book that you read, Maharaj, and what?
Well, then during the summer, actually, you're talking about Prabhupada's books. I heard the first reading ever on earth of the Krishna book. Because Prabhupada, I didn't know it then, but I went home for the summer, and my family lived in Beverly Hills. So I went home for the summer, and Prabhupada was living just a few blocks from me, which I didn't know. Because in the LA temple then, it was the one on La Cienega Boulevard before they bought Watsika. So that temple had no quarters for Prabhupada. There was nowhere for Prabhupada to stay. So they rented a house for him in Beverly Hills. And Prabhupada that summer he began to write the Krishna book. So he was recording tapes, and then the tapes would go to the LA temple and they would transcribe them, and they would make a carbon copy. That's what CC, I mean, literally it was a carbon copy. You put that blue paper in. And so then they would give one copy to the temple. So then they would, in the afternoon, the devotees would gather and they would read what Prabhupada had just translated. So I happened to walk in the back. It was an old church building. And so it's like in a typical church, certainly in America and probably in Europe also. There's like a little patio in the front and then some steps. And you go into the actual sanctuary. And often in churches, when you go into the sanctuary, there's a little sort of like vestibule, like a little room you go in first, where they may have bathrooms or they may just have books. And then you go into the actual sanctuary. So I went into that vestibule. I went into that, entrance hall, and the devotees were all sitting there on a rug. They had a rug in the temple room. The devotees were all sitting there, and they just begun to read the Krishna book. And it was chapter 1. It was the birth of Lord Krishna. And so I, of course, had no idea what Vedic literature was or anything. And I listened to it. And what's very interesting, the devotees never knew that I was there. Because they were all facing the altar, and I came in, the back, and I just sat there and listened to the reading of the first chapter of the Krishna book. And I was with a friend who was not very enlightened. So, this person wanted to go. Why don't we go? So after the chapter, and I left with this person thinking I'm never going to bring this person again. They're too foolish to appreciate this. But the devotees never knew I was there. But it was life-changing, because my impression hearing Prabhupada's translation was, I thought, well, this is like the Jesus story, his birth, because it's a sacred birth. But the big difference is this birth is full of opulence, because Krishna, there were so many jewels, and so I thought this is even much better, because it's a sacred birth, but with beauty and opulence. So then I started coming to the temple, and I bought that abridged Bhagavad Gita. And that's what really ended my material life. And I started to read it. And as soon as I started to read the Bhagavad Gita, it just transported me to a spiritual place. And I still remember what I read in I think it was maybe the introduction, I can't remember, that convinced me this is it. This is the absolute truth. It was Prabhupada's statement that we are qualitatively one with God and quantitatively different. Veda, Veda, Tattva. And when I read that, I was, in my home, Beverly Hills, I was sort of lying on the, like young man, they just sort of lying on the couch, reading the book. And when I read that, I remember I just shouted, Eureka.
You shouted?
Eureka. Eureka, like I just knew this is the perfect explanation of everything.
Mm.
Veda Tattva is the perfect explanation of reality.
Mm.
Because, of course, I'd been raised in the Judeo-Christian traditions where we're separated from God. And then I'd been exposed a little bit to this sort of foolishness of complete monism, where, you are God, everything is God, which, sounds nice to an immature mind, but upon further examination turns out to be just nonsense. So when Prabhupada said there's oneness and there's also difference, I just knew immediately this is the absolute truth.
Hmm.
This is the perfect explanation of everything. And then I began to read that Gita. The last vacation I took with my family before joining the cult of Chaitanya was, outside Los Angeles. There's beautiful mountains just about an hour and a half outside LA that go up about 2,000 meters. And there are big lakes on top of the mountain. So it's popular for people to go there. So my family, we took a vacation there. And so I remember on the way back, because Los Angeles is semi-arid, it's like a Mediterranean climate. And so when you're coming back from the mountain, because there's not a lot of forests on the way down because it's Mediterranean, you could just see forever. So I remember I was in the backseat of the car and all my brothers, my mother saying, "Oh, look how beautiful it is. Look how beautiful." And I was just reading the book and said, material energy is the illusory energy of Krishna. And I remember I was in the backseat just saying, actually, that's the illusory energy. So yes, it was reading Bhagavad Gita ended my material life and really put me on the spiritual platform. And especially when I read Beta, I knew I found the perfect explanation of everything.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing. I think it's always nice to hear how Prabhupada's books have such an effect on the lives of us, people in general. Now, we were talking about in the introduction about your bio, because later on you actually, in the 90s, you returned to the university and then you did your studies of world religion. And then after graduation, you also continued study at Harvard University, where you received a PhD finally in Sanskrit and Indian studies. And I think you're also fluent in 7 different languages. And I mean, you're very much learned in different fields of knowledge. And this is the topic we like to talk a little bit today in a sense of Shastra Chakshu, like education, knowledge, learning, which of course it's a very important aspect of human life, that humans always want to know more and learn. But then when we look at Srila Prabhupada, he often challenged the modern education system. Like Prabhupada would even say that compare schools and colleges to slaughterhouses, which sounds quite an extreme statement. Would you like to explain to us what did Prabhupada mean with this, that material education is like a slaughterhouse?
Yeah, actually, when I went back to college, people said he's going to a slaughterhouse. This is a fault. Prabhupada basically made 2 criticisms of material education.
Mm-hmm.
One of the criticisms was teaching materialism. Prabhupada had no objection to objective knowledge. In fact, knowledge is Krishna. I mean, because if you learn objectively about the material world, you're learning about God because he made it. You're studying his creation. But so some devotees don't understand the difference, and this is very unfortunate because it leads them to grossly misrepresent Prabhupada. They don't understand the difference between science and scientism. Science is just knowledge. which Prabhupada respected, which Prabhupada appreciated, which Prabhupada celebrated, as I can read in a purport I'll read in a second. Mm-hmm. Scientism means it's a fanatical belief in the power of science, material science, to explain everything. Mm-hmm. If you look at Prabhupada's Life Comes from Life conversations, Prabhupada never objected to science. He objected to scientism. In other words, taking and scientism or materialism is not science. It's a philosophy, and it's a pretty stupid philosophy, but it's the philosophy that everything can be explained materially, which is absurd. I mean, for various reasons, it's an absurd claim. For example, nowadays in the Western countries and most places in the world, they have democracy based on the belief that people are entitled to equal justice. But the idea that we're equal, that we should get equal justice, or the idea of justice itself is not empirical. You can't empirically, I mean, the Scottish skeptic, David Hume, made the point that you can't derive a metaphysical fact from a physical fact. Like, let's say, for example, someone goes and shoots an innocent person. So if you study that act from an empirical point of view, all the forensic evidence, you can't find any evil. It's just a physical act. And so to judge it, that was criminal or that was immoral, that's a metaphysical judgment. To say that something is beautiful is a metaphysical judgment. For example, you can study all the human faces on earth, and if you say this face or that mountain or this flower or that music, if you say it's beautiful, empirically, that's meaningless. There's no such thing as beauty empirically. There's no such thing as justice. There's no such thing as equality. So it's interesting if you look at, for example, your country, Switzerland or America or the modern democratic countries, in establishing a political system and a justice system, they subordinate all the empirical evidence to a metaphysical assumption: equality, justice. So therefore, anyone that believes in equality, anyone that believes in justice, anyone that believes there's actually such a thing as beauty in the world, goodness, that person lives in a bi-dimensional universe. I mean, to use the terminology from the school of Aristotle, it's a universe in which there is a physical reality and a metaphysical reality. So therefore, scientism is just complete foolishness. It's just, it's the worst kind of blind fanaticism. And that's what Prabhupada opposed. He liked science because science, it was because of science that we were able to publish Prabhupada's books. It was because of science that Prabhupada could travel around the world and preach. It was because of science that Prabhupada could communicate with his disciples. So I'll read one little passage from the purport. This is the Bhagavatam 1:5-22. Sanskrit is idangi pungsas tapasakshutasya va swistasya suktasya chabudhi datayo avichuto arto kavibhir nirupito jarutama sloka gunanu varnanam. Which Prabhupada translates, learned circles have positively concluded that the infallible purpose of the advancement of knowledge, namely austerity, study of the Vedas, sacrifice, chanting of hymns, and charity, culminates in the transcendental descriptions of the Lord, who is defined in choice poetry. So Prabhupada begins his purport by saying, human intellect is developed for advancement of learning in art, science, philosophy, physics, chemistry, psychology, economics, politics, etc. So Prabhupada said that's the purpose of developing human intelligence. That's why Krishna gave us that intelligence. And then Prabhupada says, by culture of such knowledge, the human society can attain perfection of life. He's talking about physics, chemistry, philosophy, history. He says by cultivation of this knowledge, human society attains perfection of life. This perfection of life culminates in the realization of the supreme being Vishnu. So that's the point. So you have this sort of this crude neophyte idea that we embrace Prabhupada's books and reject material knowledge. But Prabhupada is saying the opposite. Prabhupada is saying that this highest knowledge of Krishna consciousness is the culmination of a process of learning. So it's the, it's the peak of the mountain. In fact, in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna uses a Sanskrit term to mean a self-realized soul, which is kutastha. You find this in chapter 15, where he defines that the infallible souls are kutastha. Kuta literally in Sanskrit means a peak, like a mountain peak. And so kutastha means one who stands at the peak. So even the very term for a self-realized soul, or the infallible self-realized soul, is not one who rejects the mountain of material knowledge, but one who stands at the peak of it, the culmination of it, which is Krishna consciousness. I have a disciple, his name is Arka, in Australia, who did a PhD dissertation in Prabhupada's attitude and Iskcon's attitude towards science.
Interesting.
And what he found is that many devotees are much more extreme and fanatical than Prabhupada. And they think they're being loyal devotees or, holding up the flag of Iskcon by rejecting legitimate science. Even, for example, take the point of, let's say, psychology. A devotee wrote a letter to Prabhupada asking, some devotees most mentally disturbed or something. Prabhupada gave this, he had this amazing common sense. So Prabhupada said, when your body's sick, you go to the body doctor. When your mind is sick, you go to the mind doctor. So Prabhupada said, he used to always say there's no university where they study the soul. But actually there is. I mean, Prabhupada's statement is true if you mean universities in general, especially public universities. But for example, there are many Catholic universities, many Protestant universities where they definitely study the soul. And even nowadays in just regular secular universities, there is a revival of interest in dualism, philosophical dualism, the idea that the body and soul are different. And so if there is a soul, what does it mean? So they are actually studying that now. What does it mean? What does it mean to talk about a soul that's not material? And if you study ancient philosophy, for example, Plato, one great philosopher in the 20th century, said that 2,000 years of Western, or two and a half thousand years of Western philosophical tradition is just a series of footnotes on Plato. So Plato talks about the soul, he talks about reincarnation, he talks about karma, and that's studied in universities. So in philosophy courses, for example, I taught about the soul at the University of Florida because I taught a course, which is what Prabhupada wanted. And Prabhupada said that if we can teach Krishna consciousness in the universities, he said that will save America and save the world. So not only did Prabhupada not forbid academic qualification, he said that if we can get academic qualifications and preserve our Krishna consciousness, that would save the world. And he also said that women should become university professors. So Prabhupada, you can't really understand Prabhupada's views on many topics unless you know everything he said about it. So you can find Prabhupada saying, yes, women can just, cook and sew and And then you have statements from Prabhupada that women should get PhDs and teach in universities.
So if I understand you properly, basically Prabhupada didn't reject material knowledge or academic studies.
No, he celebrated it. He celebrated
with the idea that actually that knowledge should lead one to realization of God. So basically, if someone is a scientist, then he should be a scientist, but he should try to prove the existence of God, or he should try to kind of go towards the spiritual dimension.
Yes, that's what Prabhupada says in his purport. Yes, for example, a scientist or a philosopher of science can problematize philosophical materialism, which is really bad philosophy. It's actually very stupid. I mean, it's I don't know what other word to use. It's just foolishness. It's just gross foolishness. Philosophically, it's not foolish because the real truth is Krishna. It's foolish just because it's such bad philosophy. And so, yes, exactly. But you can't do that. You cannot teach Krishna consciousness to educated people unless you're educated. Yeah. For example, look at Rupa Goswami. Rupa Goswami was one of the great scholars of his century. If you look at the 6 Goswamis, they were highly learned. They didn't just read our books. The 6 Goswamis were able to do what they did because they were such great scholars. Take, for example, rasa vichar, like rasa analysis, which is a big part of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Rupa Goswami didn't invent that. He was dovetailing it. Because rasa vichar, analyzing rasas and rasavasa, and the 5 primary rasas and 7 secondary rasas, that had already existed for centuries. That was a very big thing among Indian intellectuals, analyzing literature, analyzing different things. And so Rupa Goswami Krishnized it. But he couldn't have done that unless he was a great scholar in the non-Krishna conscious rasa theory. Mm-hmm. Similarly, if you look at Rupa Goswami's style of writing Sanskrit, very sophisticated. It's called kavya, from the word kavi. With kavi, the word kavi, came to mean, it means a wise person, but it can also mean like a poet. So kavya, sort of advanced poetics. You see that very clearly in Lord Chaitanya. Lord Chaitanya's debate with the Keshav Kashmiri Pandit. In 5,000 years ago, Krishna appeared as a Kshatriya. And so, of course, the gopis, the greatest devotees. But in terms of Krishna's transformation of the world 5,000 years ago, the most important devotees were those who, like Krishna, were Kshatriyas, the Pandavas, the Yadus. And so it's very significant that in this age, Krishna appeared as a Brahmana. So just as in terms of transforming the world, it was the Kshatriya devotees who helped the so-called Kshatriya Krishna. So in this age, Lord Chaitanya appeared as a Brahmana. Mm-hmm. And if you look at his greatest followers, the 6 Goswamis and others, they were great scholars, not just in our books. They were just great scholars. And they used that learning. For example, look at Baladev Vidyabhushan, who wrote the Vedanta commentary, the Gaudiya Vaidya. In order for him to write the commentary, he had to get the equivalent of a few PhDs. You had to know everything about Sanskrit grammar, not just, okay, I know Sanskrit, I can read a sloka. You had to get into very advanced Sanskrit grammar. He had to get into all kinds of theological and philosophical points, nyaya, logic. He had to master formal logic. So it was a very high entry level. If you wanted to get into the Vedanta game, if you wanted to, it's like playing in the World Cup. If you wanted to, compete with a commentary on Vedanta, you had to get the equivalent of a few PhDs. You had to know logic. You had to know previous commentaries. You had to be an absolute master of Sanskrit. I mean, grammar, linguistics. You had to know philosophy. And so we come from a very learned tradition. We come from, I mean, not only academic, because obviously, you know, there are all kinds of devotees and they're all dear to Krishna. But if you look at Ramanuja, if you look at Lord Chaitanya himself, if you look at the six Goswamis, if you look at Baladev Vidyabhushan, Bhakti, I mean, we come from a tradition which is very scholarly and academic. You look at Bhakti Vinod Thakur. Bhakti Vinod was a leading intellectual of his time. Mm. I mean, he was very learned. He was up to date on all the philosophical currents, literary currents, theology. We come from a line in which there have been many great academic scholars who are among the most important acharyas in Gaudiya history. So it would be pathetic and completely mindless to say that in this age, devotees should completely break with that tradition, reject that tradition, and at least some, I mean, obviously most devotees are not really meant for an academic career. I mean, it's just not their nature. But we should have in Iskcon a very powerful academic wing. Because, for example, everyone's not a pujari, obviously. In fact, 99% of the devotees in Iskcon are not pujaris. However, everyone benefits from the deity worship. So if you ask a simple question, take Europe, take South America, how many schools are there? Almost none. So, is Iskcon, I mean, for every dollar that Iskcon spends on education, it probably spends thousands of dollars on rituals. So, if we want to talk about, how we, in my view, we're not going to convince Western people to become Hindus. As Prabhupada said, if you tell a Christian he or she should become a Hindu, they'll kick on your face. Prabhupada actually said that. So Prabhupada came to the West to reconstitute a Brahmin order. Iskcon is supposed to be producing a Brahmin class. The four activities of Brahmins, yajan, yajan, patan, patan, which means, performing rituals or sacrifices, engaging others in those ceremonies, studying and teaching others. And Prabhupada, of course, obviously said of these two parallel lines, Bhagavad Vidhi and Pancharatric Vidhi, the Bhagavad Vidhi is most important. So follow the money trail. How much money does Iskcon spend on schools, higher education, university level seminaries to train learned devotees? And how much money does Iskcon spend building big temples with fabulous rituals and deity? And yet Prabhupada said the educational side, the teaching side is more important. So any society, in order to be successful, must have the power of self-criticism. I'm a loyal member of Iskcon, but I think loyalty demands of me that I not be foolish, that I not close my eyes. If you're driving a car and you see the car is going too far to the side and you turn the wheel, that's not like, you're not being disloyal. You're saving your life and you're saving the life of the passengers in the car. So, I mean, we have to just consider that. Follow the money trail. How much money? So is Iskcon known in the world as a movement with the best educational system? Is Iskcon known as even a movement that has an educational system? How many public intellectuals do we have? How many devotees in the real world are leading voices in the great issues of our day? Like, how do you save society? How do you produce a moral society? What should be the proper relationship between society and religion? What is religion? where are we? Devotees are not there very much. So I think, when you talk about the education ministry, the real task in my extremely humble opinion, but I see the real responsibility of the education ministry is to promote education. Iskcon needs to be known as an educational movement.
Yes, Srila Prabhupada said every temple actually should be an educational institute, like a place for learning, right?
Yes. Yes, every temple and not just, how should I put it? There's a difference between just teaching our doctrine and actually educating people.
Mm.
Prabhupada said religion without philosophy is sentimentalism or fanaticism. So many devotees think that if you just memorize our doctrine, then you're a philosopher. But if you look at what Prabhupada taught, how he explained religion and philosophy, he didn't just mean just to memorize our philosophy, but to actually learn how to reason well, to learn how to respond, to learn to translate our teachings into a philosophical language that people can understand.
I think it's a very powerful point you made. Like, if you look at how much is invested into temple rituals and how much is in education, I really agree that there is a disbalance. That's a powerful point. And in the beginning, we spoke about Prabhupada criticism on material knowledge, and you explained it beautifully also. Now, another aspect I believe Prabhupada also emphasized was that actually knowledge, vidya, one should become a gentleman. Like, knowledge should lead to good qualities.
Yeah, a lady or a gentleman.
Yeah, right. So that's also one thing. Like modern education, you may have a professor who knows a lot, but then his personal behavior is maybe going a different direction. So
yeah, they almost celebrate their decadence.
Yeah. So that's another aspect.
Because they're not really learning. They've separated knowledge from behavior.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, if you consider the Isopanishad says, Vidyang cha justad vedo bhayang saha avidyaya mrityung tirtva vidyaya mritamashnute. I will give you the verse number in case anyone, let's see. Yeah. That's mantra 11 of the Isopanishad, mantra 11. And what it says is that one who knows both, I mean, literally, it's a, how should I put it? It is a sophisticated verse that's using irony, because it says, because vidya means knowledge. It's just another word from the same root as Veda. Vidya, knowledge. And it's also often used to mean like science. And then avidya, the way you say ignorance in Sanskrit is you say unknowledge. Avidya, unknowledge. And actually, even ignorance is really like, if you think agnostic or ignorance, that gno, ignorance or ignorance, what's the other said, or it actually, or agnostic means the same thing, not knowing. It actually, the gna is just Sanskrit gyan.
Not knowledge, not having knowledge. Yeah.
Yeah, so to be agnostic means to be, it's just from the Greek, from the Sanskrit, agyani. So it's interesting because the words are used here, vidyang cha, avidyang cha, and then yestad vedo bhayang. Ubhayang means both. One who knows both. So the acharyas take, and then, the long tradition takes that vidya, of course, means spiritual knowledge, and avidya, unknowledge, means knowledge of this world. So it's sort of it's a play on words in Sanskrit. If you know Sanskrit, there's all kinds of jokes and plays on words and things like that. It's a very It's intellectually sophisticated. It's not just Moses coming down with the 10 Commandments. It's actually, it's so then avidyaya mrityung tirtva, which means literally by ignorance, one crosses over death. I mean, clearly, if you do, there's all kinds of jokes, there's all kinds of plays on words in Sanskrit. So it's very consciously saying something which is like, how could that be true? That you cross over death by ignorance. And then vidyaya, and by knowledge, amritam ashnute, you achieve immortality. And so, as everyone has explained, the great Vaishnava has explained forever that here, avidya, ignorance, means material knowledge. Because if you don't understand this world, how can you make sure that you're not really, that you really have a spiritual idea? Because you may have a particular understanding, but if you don't understand yourself, if you have no understanding of your own psychology, if you have no understanding of the world, how will you advance? So it's a very ironic statement. It's like tadejati tanaijati. It moves, it doesn't move. Talking about the absolute truth. It moves, it doesn't move. Tadejati tanaijati. Tadure. It is far away. Tadtuantike, but it is very close. Tadantarasya sarvasya. It is within everything. Tadu sarvasyasya vayata. It is outside of everything. So, you cross over death by ignorance. So these are like what I call literary speed bumps. It's like they have in the road, they put a bump there, so you have to slow down your car.
To kind of reflect.
Yes. So therefore, having material, Prabhupada was able to do what he did, of course, first of all, because he was a pure devotee, but also because he was educated. Prabhupada constantly recycled his college education. He didn't come to America and say, okay, it's all nonsense. English is nonsense. I'm just going to speak Sanskrit or Hindi. Prabhupada was constantly engaging. That's why, because he was brilliant. He was a brilliant administrator. He was a pure devotee. And he understood the world. He used to read the newspapers.
And if I may ask, then it means if I really understood the world and the spiritual dimension, like both, then I will be able to also act properly, like my behavior will also be in line. Is that the point? Because we spoke about...
Yes, because Krishna, for example, in her prayers, Kunti Devi says to Krishna that different people have different theories of why you came to this world. And so even when Krishna came, there were different theories. And so then she says that when you come nato natya dharojata, like an actor in costume. So even if you knew how Krishna dressed 5,000 years ago, and you don't because it's not in the Bhagavatam, but even if you knew that, it doesn't mean that that's from the spiritual world, because Kunti Devi says nato natya dharojata, like an actor in costume. Pretend, and then the first chapter of the Bhagavatam says, Kritavan kila karmani saharamena keshava atimartyani bhagavan guda kapita manusha. When Krishna came with Balaram to this world and performed all these amazing superhuman activities, he did it guda, disguised, in disguise, kapita manusha, pretending to be a human being. So Krishna inserted himself, he integrated himself into human society. And therefore, if you look at Lord Chaitanya, how he dressed, what his customs were, they're very different from Krishna, because he was integrating in a very different society. For example, Krishna was raised by Mother Yashoda and Nanda. And so all of his meals were prepared by a Vaishya, so-called Vaishya woman. But when Krishna came as Lord Chaitanya, he never ate in the home of a Vaishya. Why? Because the customs had changed. So we have to think. Thinking is not illicit.
Thank you so much, Maharaj. I think it was a very fascinating conversation. We covered several aspects on education and how to look at it in a proper way or mature way, let's say. Maybe in conclusion, because we are talking about Prabhupada's books and we are celebrating this Books of the Basis week, and we want to see how, Srila Prabhupada's books are very important to the world and what they can give to the world. In conclusion, what would you say, the Prabhupada's teachings, what role do Srila Prabhupada's books play in the academic world or in the world of education nowadays?
Okay. First of all, I will say, because I get every day these emails that have, quotes from Prabhupada and everything. So every day I'm, getting a lot of, and without question, no one can preach like Prabhupada. The level of his realization is beyond everyone. I mean, I'm just in awe. Prabhupada, his ability to cut to the point, to express difficult things very simply. He's very bold. He's very courageous. He won't take nonsense from anyone. And so Prabhupada is, without question, the number one preacher. I mean, no one can preach at his level. And so, but again, what you get from Prabhupada's books also depends on what you bring to it. Just like if you read Prabhupada's books in English, you don't understand English, you won't, maybe you'll get benefit by touching the page or something. But so because I've studied, let's say, philosophy or psychology or sociology, when I read Prabhupada's books, I'm seeing things that I would never see if I didn't have those academic categories in my head, because I'm bringing to Prabhupada's books questions that I could never have formulated if I didn't have an education. So, if someone's extremely simple, fine, you can still go back to Godhead, no problem. Krishna loves you. But if you really want to present Krishna consciousness to educating people, Prabhupada said, for me to do that, I had to be educated. So I'm bringing all kinds of ideas and questions to Prabhupada's books, and therefore I'm seeing amazing things in Prabhupada's books that I never would have seen otherwise. So, but again, Iskcon is not just for scholars, and, it doesn't mean that someone's a better devotee because they're a scholar. That's just their service. It's like, someone can fix the car mechanic, someone can cook, someone can do academics. It's just another service.
But if someone has the ability to do that, then that devotee should be encouraged.
Absolutely. Because otherwise we won't be taken seriously. I mean, when Lord Chaitanya, if you look, like Prabhupada said, he would do Harinam for the masses, but with the more advanced people, scholars, educated people, whether it's Prakashananda or Sarvabhauma, or even the way he taught Sanatana Goswami and Rupa Goswami. With learned people, he would get engaged in very learned discourse. And it was those learned people who became the most important acharyas in our tradition. The 6 Goswamis, they were all scholars. Bhaktivinoda Thakur was a scholar. And then Prabhupada came, and because Prabhupada was an educated Indian, quote unquote, he could translate the books into English, and not only translate the books, but develop a meta language. Prabhupada actually developed, every great thinker expresses himself sort of in not a new language like English or German or French, but a new way of using the language. Prabhupada used English in a way that no one had ever used it before. Just like Plato, used ancient Greek in a way no one had ever used it. And so Prabhupada has his own meta language, which is brilliant, which gets right to the point, which is completely rational and objective. So Prabhupada, to express our philosophy, he actually created a new way of using the English language, which was an incredible contribution. But again, you wouldn't know that unless you have those categories in your head of meta language, and you had other examples in mind. And so I find that scholarship just enriches my appreciation of Prabhupada. It doesn't take me away from Prabhupada. And we have a sampradaya. We have a parampara of great thinkers, of great scholars who made necessary adaptations. Whether you are a huge reptile or a religious movement, if you don't adapt to your environment, you will become extinct.
Thank you so much, Maharaj. I think
My pleasure.
You gave us a lot of food for thought also. And
Prasada for thought, yes. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your service. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Maharaj. Okay, Hare Krishna, Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Hi, Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama.